Mic check 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Canon Caucus. Check 1, 2. Testing, testing.
Everyone can begin to have their seats. We'll call to order this hearing of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. This is an unusual hearing for us, and it's exciting. In the back room, it sounded like it was a reception because everybody was so excited to see their friends and to reconnect. And that was happening on a social level, and now we're going to reconnect on a professional level. One thing that we know for each of you is you've had an incredible career in Congress, an incredible career in national security, incredible careers on this committee. We do not want to lose your resident expertise. And we believe that you worked on a bipartisan basis, and we're certainly all about getting this committee working back on a bipartisan basis. So we want to turn to you today to get your advice, issues that you see that you think we need to be focused on, and issues that you think this committee, as you have seen the work that we have doing, should either continue or modify in a way that we're undertaking them. And so I want to first introduce who we have in front of us. We have former Congresswoman Jane Harman, who during her time in Congress remained steadfast in her commitment to U.S. national security. Ms. Harman served as the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee in the 107th and 108th Congress. She also chaired the House Homeland Security Subcommittee on Intelligence and served as the president and CEO of the Wilson Center following her time in office. Former Congressman Frank LoBiondo, who earned a reputation in Congress as an advocate for the intelligence community's work in some of the most remote and dangerous areas of the world where he himself would often travel. Former Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who made history as the first Hispanic Republican woman and the first Cuban-American elected to Congress. Ms. Ros-Lehtinen was also a leader in advocacy for the U.S.-Israeli relationship during her time in the House of Representatives. Former Congressman Pete King, who is known for his dedication to U.S. counterterrorism efforts. Mr. King previously served as chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee in the 109th and the 112th Congress, and he's a well-known commentator on national security and world affairs. And former Congressman Jim Langevin, who was a leading voice on cybersecurity issues. Mr. Langevin chaired the Armed Services Subcommittee on Intelligence in the 116th Congress. And Mr. Langevin also served as the chair to my being his ranking member on the strategic subcommittee of armed services. We appreciate that each of you are here today. We know that in your preparation, you were asked these basic questions. What are the most critical threats facing our nation? What is the proper role of the intelligence community in our nation's response to these threats? What was the unfinished business of this committee while you served in Congress that you believe that this committee needs to continue? And any other advice or thoughts that you might have for us, we welcome you here today, and I recognize my ranking member, Jim Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a big thank you to our former colleagues for taking the time to be here today and to provide your expertise. It's great to see all of you again. All of you developed a tremendous amount of knowledge while you were members, and I'd like to commend the chairman for bringing us together in this venue so you can share your perspective and expertise on the work we do here in the Intelligence Committee. I say this all the time. The fact is that intelligence oversight is very, very hard. We all served on other committees where you have the assistance of an aggressive press, of nonprofits, of others who are scrutinizing the financial services industry, the carbon industry, all sorts of things. In this committee, quite often it is just us and our staff to look at some of the most challenging and provoking issues that we face as a country. And of course, intelligence oversight involves command of very complicated technical issues, very complicated legal issues. It is difficult in the short time that we are given here on this committee to develop the expertise that really does the American people proud by making sure that our intelligence community is both immensely capable, but that it operates inside the values and the legal bounds of the Constitution. I've said before that oftentimes as members of this committee, we tend to get hyper-focused on some of the areas that are tremendously important, but exceptionally narrow. As people who have sat in these very seats previously, my hope is you can point us to areas where we should be focusing on more holistically instead of risking losing the forest for the trees. Finally, China. There's obviously lots and lots of challenges out there, but the challenges and opportunities posed by China, I think, are very different than things that we've seen in the past. Often my colleagues, I think, inappropriately invoke the concept of a new Cold War. The reality is that when we were in the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, we did almost no trade with the Soviet Union. They did not own $1 trillion of our sovereign debt. We did not have the same common interests that we have with a country like China that, even as we have those common interests, violates regularly the values that are so important to us as Americans. So I hope to hear your thoughts on how this committee and Congress can thoughtfully and in statesmanlike fashion approach this critical issue. Again, thank you for being here today, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. And Mr. Chairman, yield back.
Thank you. We'll proceed with opening statements in this order. Ms. Harman, Mr. LoBiondo, Ms. Ros-Lehtinen, Mr. King, and Mr. Langevin. We'll begin with Ms. Harman.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Good morning, everyone. I served with some of you, as we all did, over the years, and Darren, I remember your father so fondly. Please say hello. And I served with all these people, and it is just enormously exciting to have a reunion of people dedicated to the intelligence enterprise. I was thinking that on 9/11, just before I became ranking member, I was walking toward the dome of the Capitol at 9 a.m. to remind that is where the Intelligence Committee rooms were, in the dome of the Capitol. Everyone thinks now that that was the intended target of the fourth plane that went down in Pennsylvania. They were aiming at us. They were obviously aiming at our government and could have maybe caused a continuity of government crisis because Congress did not have a thoughtful plan of what to do if the Capitol were attacked. But it has been a long road from then to now. The one thing that has not changed at all is, well, it did change for a while, but the one thing that is back is the bipartisan character of this committee. And I just want to commend all of you for holding hands. I gather you just went on a big trip, 11 of you, to the Middle East, and everybody got along, and there were, it was solidarity. And to remind what I said, of what I said back in the day, the terrorists won't check our party registration before they blow us up. And it is a sobering thought, and it is worth keeping in mind always, even in the toughest times, even when partisanship tends to drag us apart. It can't drag us apart on this. So you've asked about lessons learned from my long tenure on the committee, and it was 8 years on this committee. Probably the most important thing we did after two enormous intelligence failures on 9/11 and on the Iraq WMD NIE was to play a key role in drafting on a bipartisan basis and passing IRTPA. It's a pretty horrible acronym, but it stands for the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. And I remember how brave Pete Hoekstra, then committee chair, was to join with others, including me and Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman, in supporting this, in spite of the opposition from the then chair of the Armed Services Committee and the then vice president. The president was for it, they were against it, and he bravely stood up, and it passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis. So, as I said, my first piece of advice is to fight to keep the bipartisan reputation of the committee and to make certain that the overarching mission is to provide our country, is to protect our country, not one's re-election. Not that re-election doesn't matter, we all get this, but put the country first. And I applaud this committee, let me go to the topic I really want to address, for creating a bipartisan working group to focus on the reauthorization of Section 702 of FISA. Again, to remind, in the 70s, I was working in the Carter White House when the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act passed on a bipartisan basis to correct the abuses that had been identified by the Church Committee. It also set up this committee back in the day, and FISA was strictly adhered to over many, many years. And then it turned out that after 9/11, the administration, instead of following FISA, went through the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department and came up with a series of opinions to justify practices outside of FISA. And when Congress found this out, which we did, it was disclosed by some reporters, and then President Bush 43 partially declassified a program that was underway. We, that would be Congress, not just one party, worked to amend FISA, to modernize FISA, which should have happened long before, and to include Section 702, among other things. It wasn't perfect. Guess what? Legislation is often not perfect. It probably needs to be updated and tweaked, but it should not expire. It should not expire. That would be hugely dangerous, and I just want to make the point that this committee is on the case, and I really appreciate the efforts of all of you to try to find the best answers. My second recommendation is to make AI, artificial intelligence, a central focus of your work. To do this, you need technical capacity in your staff. You also need technical capacity in your own heads, but I would suggest that digital natives, some of you may be that, I am not one of those people, really have to understand how the technology works in order to help you embrace it, put guardrails around it, and to understand that AI has huge dangers, but it also has huge advantages. And as open source intelligence becomes an increasing part of the intelligence enterprise, AI will be all over it, and you have to understand what can happen there. Third piece of advice, focus on China as a peer competitor, but don't surge everything on China. The world remains dangerous. Think North Korea, think Iran, think some things that are going on in Africa, think domestic extremists, think all the things in addition to China that you have to stay focused on. So you need a whole of world approach to the intelligence enterprise, and I suggest, again, while focusing on China as probably, and I would think this too, the #1 threat, keep brain cells and attention on other things. And finally, the IC in Congress should be commended for understanding that declassified intelligence has a role to play in deterrence and the broader U.S. security. The declassification of intelligence on Ukraine was central in preparing the Ukrainians for the fight and ensuring that the world recognized Russian aggression for what it was, and for making sure that the Russians knew that we were staying one step ahead. Back in my day, not only was there overclassification, which remains a problem, but there also was an aversion to any declassification. And it's a very good, I think, deterrent, and it was used skillfully by our intelligence community this time. So in conclusion, many of these tasks are different now from my days on the committee. But the challenge of terrorism and the challenge of China endure, and this committee is on it. So I just am optimistic about what you can do working together and what we would all like to do to help you. This is a happy little band of bipartisan friends, and we're here to help. And I think it was an inspired idea to have this hearing and to let us all hug each other again. Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. LoBiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Turner, and Mr. Himes for putting this together. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today to share my insights from serving on the House Intelligence Committee for the final 8 years of my 24-year tenure in the United States Congress. My time on the committee was certainly some of the most personally rewarding and professionally challenging of opportunities in my career in public service, and it's a privilege to have been appointed to HPSCI and to chair the CIA subcommittee for a period of time. As you know, there are many aspects of serving on HPSCI that we cannot discuss beyond the walls of the SCIF. Most Americans will never know the true extent of the threats to our national security and the role those who serve on HPSCI and CISI play in conjunction with the men and women of our intelligence community in thwarting those planned attacks. That is what makes your jobs today so critically essential to securing our future going forward. There's no shortage of issues before the committee for you to be rightly focused on. From Russian aggression in Europe to North Korea's provocation in Asia, from Iran's nuclear ambitions to the erosion of democratic institutions across the globe. The geopolitical picture is increasingly complex, while the security situation is exponentially more fragile. But I want to focus my remarks today on a region that is often overlooked by U.S. policymakers to the detriment of our own national security interests and security overall, and that is Africa. The dual threat of China's systematic expansion alongside the resurgence of terrorist recruitment and training makes ignoring Africa a grave and strategic mistake for the United States. The unfinished business of our Intelligence Committee is crucial to understanding China's advances and the operational capabilities that terrorist groups are developing in various locations on the continent. During my time on the committee, I made approximately 24 trips to the African continent. My primary focus was the front lines of engagement in the most hostile regions by our intelligence case officers and U.S. Special Forces. Places like Somalia, Angola, Mali, Niger, Djibouti, not the destinations American tourists or of state visits. Often I was the first sitting member of Congress to visit some of these places in decades. In the 5 years since my last trip, the situation has only grown more desperate from my vantage point, and the biggest geopolitical challenge to the United States is taking advantage of that. Let me be blunt. I believe China is bribing its way across the African continent, creating economic partnerships with impoverished African nations for its own global security objectives. From securing leasing rights for rare earth minerals to assessing key transportation infrastructure along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, China has muscled its way into the void created by lack of sustained U.S. policy and engagement by numerous administrations. In my opinion, our diplomatic engagement has been marginalized for compelling priorities, while our intelligence collection capabilities have been wholly inadequate for the entirety of the 21st century. This is providing opportunities not only for China, but for the direct threats to U.S. interests and assets. Weak central governments across the sub-Saharan are allowing terrorist groups like al-Shabaab and Boko Haram to expand operational training grounds to export their death and destruction to Western democracies with their main goal of attacking the United States. Offshoots of al-Qaeda and ISIS are looking to the Congo, Burkina Faso, Libya, Central African Republic, and other economically depressed nations to gain a foothold. Recruitment of young men to terrorism is made easier by the sense of disillusionment with their own governments, fueled by abandonment by the United States in the region. What keeps me up at night is the critical mistake the U.S. could make by further reducing intelligence capabilities in Africa. Instead of reducing, we really must ramp up, not cut back. The federal resources and manpower we have in the CIA, NSA, and other intelligence partners to get a better understanding of how badly we are falling behind is important. A robust human intelligence program on the continent would give a greater insight into how these terrorist groups are developing their operational capabilities. And in my view, from my time on the committee and all the trips, there is no substitute for human intelligence. The ability to develop a human intelligence source takes years. The language barriers, the customs, all that goes on. And when we let that go, we're letting a key part of our ability to understand what happens go. Furthermore, let me take this opportunity to say that the briefings in Washington are no substitute for the feedback that I or you can receive when engaging station chiefs or an analyst in the field. Beyond the skiff and outside of Washington is where you, as members of the committees, will get the unvarnished assessments to help you better do your jobs and budgets. When you sit down with a station chief in one of these godforsaken remote areas, excuse me, you'll understand the sacrifices not only that they make, but how critical their input is to the work you do for the authorization for our intelligence community. Without their input, I don't believe Langley can give you a good picture of what needs to be done. I came to quickly realize that the more hostile environment, the more honest the conversation with those men and women who volunteered for those posts. And make no mistakes, they are volunteers. They're not directed to go there, so they're sacrificing a great deal. Thus, ongoing direct contact with CIA station chiefs in these very challenging countries is absolutely necessary to understand the authorization needs of the intelligence communities to ensure that the U.S. does not fall further behind. Let me conclude by saying that the job is not done, far from it. And now you, who are charged with the critical work of providing federal resources, political support, and yes, vigorous oversight to the intelligence community. You are also charged with being uniform in the application of those duties across the agencies while holding accountable those who abuse the authority you've entrusted to them. The national security mission of this committee must be must be bipartisan. It must be nonpartisan. Historically, this was an implicit fact rather than an explicit objective. It was this way during my time on the committee, well, at least most of it, and for many former members of this panel today, but regrettably changed in the years following my retirement. Now in 2023, after years of political agendas infiltrating the national security debate, there is a confidence returning to those of us who still work in this space because of clear and concerted effort by Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Himes, and all of you to diligently focus on doing the nation's work rather than scoring political points. On behalf of those of us who are encouraged by what we've seen so far, from your joint media appearances to the recent bipartisan CODEL, intelligence partners in the Middle East, the tone you have set gives me hope that HPSCI is once again focused solely on the national security mission of this great nation. Thank you for returning HPSCI to its fundamental roots, and because of that, I sit here before you as a willing partner and resounding advocate for your efforts, and hope that my testimony can be helpful to your critical work, and I look forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and to all of my colleagues, former colleagues. And I'm very honored to be before you, offering my very limited perspectives. First, I'd like to commend the intelligence work on the threat from China, both to the U.S. and to Taiwan. Likewise, I commend the importance that you have placed on the continued enrichment of uranium by Iran. That's my take on nation-state threats. Good intelligence regarding nation-state threats is useful and motivating improved military funding and readiness, which I believe are both inadequate today. Second, like most people, I want everything, which means that I urge the U.S. and the committee to not significantly reduce the profile of the counterterrorism threat. For example, the 9/11 Commission report urged improved border security, yet public reports about our southern border give the impression that we no longer take the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission seriously. What is the terrorist threat impact of conditions on our southern border? Third, I think some point work and cooperation with the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I had the honor of chairing and serving as the ranking member, and other relevant committees might prove useful and productive. Of course, I recognize the secrecy issue of information that may provide some severe restrictions. Fourth, I know that the public would appreciate a thorough review of any possible abuses of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA. I've always believed that FISA is useful and important, but the effectiveness and longevity of FISA will depend ultimately on public confidence in its application. Fifth, a related subject is the government's relationship to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Were public reports of false statements to the court accurate? What were the consequences? Perhaps the gravest damage to our public confidence are the reports of government misrepresentation to the court with apparently little negative consequences to the government. Sixth, the committee should consider what strengthened sanctions may be added to FISA to fight abuse. I hope that a strong and vibrant FISA remains while abuses are curtailed. Of course, broad FISA authority and strong restrictions and sanctions for abuse may seem contradictory, and unless carefully drafted, they may indeed be contradictory. So good luck in somehow achieving both goals. But I have the confidence that you can find your way through that maze. And finally, as my other colleagues have said, I was so pleased to observe that the bipartisan nature of this committee once again, with the Speaker and the Minority Leader emphasizing nonpartisanship at your first meeting. That goes a long way to setting the tone. Intelligence was my favorite committee, while it was nonpartisan in approach. It didn't stay that way, but I'm pleased as punch to see that bipartisan spirit alive and well once again, and that is thanks to both you, Mr. Chairman, the ranking member, and all of the members. Thank you for this privilege.
Thank you. Mr. King.
Thank you, Chairman Turner, Ranking Member Himes. I want to really thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify at this morning's hearing. Alongside colleagues I had the privilege of serving with on this committee, I am very appreciative. Also, I may just take a moment out to mention some of your staff members. First of all, Mike Halgani was tremendous in getting me ready for the hearing. Mandy Bowers, who worked for me when I was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, is now with Intel. I really thank her for years of good work. John Tucci, who's a new member of your committee staff. Actually, he grew up with my children. He worked in my district office years ago, went on to a great career in the military, and now he's here with the committee. So I wish John well. Also, I saw Lisa Major was here. She's somewhere in the gallery. But when I was on the committee, she was assigned to me as my artificial intelligence, and she did a great job. So I want to thank her for that. Listen, there's no committee that's more vital or essential to our national security than this Intelligence Committee. I'm sure each of us on the panel agrees that the greater the level of committee bipartisanship, the greater the likelihood of the committee fulfilling its daunting mandate. The issues and potential world crises which face the committee are many, with China, Russia, Iran, cybersecurity, porous border security, and invasion of Ukraine being just a few. In no way would I suggest that the committee diminish its focus on any of these critical areas. What I am urging, though, is with all of the legitimate concerns within the intelligence community, the Congress, and the media on the issues I listed, I really ask the committee to keep and maintain a laser-like focus on the continued threat of Islamist terrorism and ensure that all facets of our government keep a similar focus. As a New Yorker who lost many hundreds of friends, neighbors, and constituents on 9/11, I will never forget the horror of that day. As a member of this committee and chairman and ranking member of the Homeland Security Committee, I dedicated myself to do all that I could to prevent another 9/11. The defenses and countermeasures that were put in place after 9/11 have been largely successful. But 9/11 is not ancient history or something to be relegated to the rearview mirror, nor is the continuing terror threat a parochial issue to New York. It affects the entire country. And unfortunately, too often Americans have short-term memory only. There was almost an 8.5-year gap between the first World Trade Center bombing in February 1993 and the attacks of 9/11. International terrorism was not an issue in the 2000 presidential race. It received little, if any, media coverage or discussion in the months leading up to 9/11. But let me, on a bipartisan note, let me emphasize that one person who never lost focus was Congresswoman Harman, and I commend her for that. Today, while ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their offshoots and affiliates have been in retreat, they are still a very lethal force. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan, the breakdown in border security, and instability in the Middle East add to their lethality. I strongly support the effort against Russian aggression in Ukraine, but we cannot allow that necessary struggle to take our allies' attention away from the cooperative anti-terror measures that were put in place after 9/11. We have learned the harsh reality that Islamist terrorists are dedicated to destroying America and our way of life. They have a great capacity to adapt and adjust and have the long view of history. We must ensure that we never, ever relive the horror of 9/11. That's my message to you. Focus on everything you're doing. And again, let me repeat what all my colleagues have said. To see this committee working in a bipartisan way means so much. Without going into detail or ascribing blame, the last 2 years that Ileana and Frank and I were on this committee, every meeting was a war. It was a battle, and it served really no national purpose. I'm not trying to ascribe blame here. I just want to thank Mike Turner and Jim Himes for what they're doing to bring this committee together and to work in one voice. We can fight over so many different issues. There was no need to be making intelligence a partisan issue. What you're doing here today and in this session of Congress is really a great tribute to the country. So thank you for what you're doing. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Himes. distinguished members of the committee, my former colleagues, I want to begin by thanking you for welcoming me here today. It's great to be at this distinguished table with former colleagues as well. And I'm certainly looking forward to talking about something that I care deeply about, and that is the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So I had the privilege of serving on the HPSCI from 2007 to 2015. HPSCI is a special committee, as we all well know, charged with some of the most important work in Congress, though much of this work cannot be discussed publicly for obvious reasons. Overseeing the intelligence community and supporting its mission is a privilege that comes with enormous responsibility, because HPSCI members are granted unique access to some of the most sensitive and critical activities that our government undertakes. The committee, of course, though, is at its best when it can operate in a bipartisan or nonpartisan manner, and I echo the words of my colleagues here at the table. For that reason, I really have been pleased to see the tone struck by Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Himes and their shared commitment to that approach. It's so important. As I look back at my service on the committee, as well as my service on the Armed Services Committee, I thought I might mention a few priorities I hope the committee will keep in mind. So to begin with, emerging technologies have and will continue to fundamentally change the world. Threats to the United States and our allies will become faster, more dispersed, and more dangerous. Artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and autonomy, synthetic biology, microelectronics, advanced computing, software, and more all present new threat streams as well as new opportunities. The committee must continue to push the intelligence community to confront as well as adapt to and leverage these technologies. Artificial intelligence in particular and machine learning will be particularly impactful. These capabilities have the possibility of advancing very noble goals and pushing humanity forward, particularly when they reflect our democratic values. But they also raise enormous challenges. Now, I'm continuously struck by the fact that many of the individuals that have helped develop and scale artificial intelligence right now are among the staunchest advocates for ensuring that it is regulated and used responsibly. This is an area that the United States, the Congress, and the committee really should seek to lead. And the impact that artificial intelligence and the massive amounts of data now available will have, the impact it will have now in the intelligence community is particularly acute. Artificial intelligence and machine learning could fundamentally change how the intelligence community collects and analyzes data and provides insight to policymakers. But it also presents enormous challenges, many of which are more appropriate for, of course, a different setting. But I can say that we are in a race with adversaries like China to develop and deploy this technology, and the winner will garner a massive and potentially insurmountable advantage. At present, however, I think that in some ways the government is really not leading the way in many emerging technology areas. And the best technology and the most talented people, along with the largest investments, are often in the private sector or academia. The government should continue to press the intelligence community to find novel ways to leverage the enormous capability and skills throughout the country, particularly from companies, universities, and organizations that do not have an established history of partnering with the government. Now, during my service in Congress and now in the private sector, I almost daily encounter companies that have incredible technology, and the national security community really does need. But all too often, they lack a clear pathway to contribute to the nation's defense and the intelligence community's mission. So likewise, it's a national security imperative to attract and retain a highly skilled and trained workforce. We could have all of the policies and the structure in place that we want, but without the people to implement it, we are at a disadvantage. So as one example, there are over approximately 700,000 jobs in cybersecurity right now that go unfilled. So the intelligence community has, I think, the best mission in the world, but it must be willing to adapt to and attract a new generation of critical skills. I would encourage the committee to push the intelligence community to identify additional ways to make career progression more flexible for intelligence community employees, create cultures that foster innovation, and develop more robust pathways for university students to serve in the national security community. In fact, I'm creating right now an institute on cyber and emerging technologies at my alma mater at Rhode Island College. I think this is a great model for bridging the gap between students with critical skills and the national security community. And I will extend an invite to all of you to visit when we're up and running. The Institute will expose a diverse group of students to cutting-edge technology while helping them to develop the skills that the nation needs to be successful. In closing, I'll also say that also attracting a diverse group of highly skilled, patriotic Americans to the intelligence community is an imperative. I can think of few places where having a diverse workforce is more critical to mission success than the intelligence community. And I encourage the committee to continue to explore ways to advance this fundamental requirement. In closing, thank you again for this opportunity to speak today on issues that I am so passionate about. And again, I commend Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Himes for the bipartisan tone that you have struck. This committee is strongest when we are working together in a bipartisan or nonpartisan way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Excellent. I want to thank all of you for your excellent comments. It really does show the range of your work. I always try to describe to people that the Intelligence Committee is like really a committee of all subcommittee chairs, because everybody has their own portfolio, their own lane that they engage on and that they advocate for, and you evidence that in your comments. And I also want to thank you for your bipartisanship statements. You're sitting here presenting to us on a bipartisan basis. You worked when you were in these chairs on a bipartisan basis, and we certainly, in honoring you, can follow that legacy and do so. So thank you so much. I've got three quick areas to ask you questions about. 702, that obviously is one of our biggest issues. I can tell you that bipartisanship on this issue has been very important. Bicameral bipartisanship also is complete resolve on 702 needs to be reauthorized, but FISA in its enlarged capacity needs to be reformed. And we're undertaking that process. I look forward to your recommendations to us as we go through that. There's some great ones out there. Jane and Ileana, you both mentioned the abuses and that Congress led in both establishing them to stop abuses in the intelligence community, amended them and modernized them to stop abuses. We have seen, and it's been very publicly discussed and publicly released here lately, the FISA court's opinion was even released that documented FISA abuses of Americans, what I consider to be civil rights. However, in reforming, we have to recognize the importance of the doing. And so I'm going to ask Pete and Jane and Ileana if each of you would take a moment and talk of the importance of FISA and 702 as a tool and how important it is that we do the collections for our national security at the same time that we're undertaking those reforms. I'll start with Jane. Ms. Harman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you all for your service at a very critical time. Let's remember, FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Foreign intelligence, focused on non-U.S. persons, but designed to prevent abuse of U.S. persons and obviously to find out what the threats to our country are. And when we amended FISA, after discovering, as I said, that the Bush 43 administration wasn't following it, we did our best to target non-U.S. persons outside the U.S., but to come up with a strategy that would get information, including information ultimately from U.S. persons if they were in the chain from foreign intelligence targets. And we did okay. We did pass these amendments on a bipartisan basis, but we had them sunset every 5 years. That's what we're talking about now. The end of this year is the second or third sunset of our effort to amend FISA. It still needs work, you're right. And I would just make 2 points. Number one, how important it is to have our activities in this area be strictly under law. That was the chapter we missed in the early Bush 43 days. And to be fair to them and us, we all thought we would be attacked again, so they were struggling to make sure that what they thought were best protections were in place. But they should have come to Congress, and we would have helped craft something maybe more careful than what we did craft. So my bottom line is there are excellent people on this committee and outside of the committee. I would just mention, as I have to some of you, Glenn Gerstel, who was the former general counsel of NSA, who is leading a hardy little band, which I'm part of, to come up with the best designed suggestions for amendments that might be in place. And you're not wrong that there were some poor practices, and you're not wrong that this legislation is essential. So I would just urge that you meet with these folks, get the best ideas, and approach this on a strictly nonpartisan basis, because the terrorists aren't going to check our party registration before they blow us up. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll build on what my friend Jane has said. FISA abuses hurt the public's credibility in our powers, and when abuses occur, public support is eroded. And FISA abuses may include, and we've seen this in recent years, exceeding authority by government agencies when carrying out foreign intelligence activities which do not require specified targeted court order, or misusing private information in a way not authorized by law, or abuses of the foreign intelligence surveillance court processes by the government. And abuses of the court processes include misrepresentation by the government in court when they make these applications, and the suspicion that some court orders were sought on occasion for political purposes. So I think that we've gone through a few difficult years of abuse of both FISA and the court, and I think that public confidence can be enhanced by the reforms that this committee will make to both FISA itself and to the court. So thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. King.
Chairman Turner, I would say, first of all, I believe that being able to intercept and monitor foreign threats coming into the U.S., any type of foreign threat that we can monitor, it's essential. We have to maintain that. At the same time, we have to realize there have been abuses, intentional and unintentional. I think among the unintentional ones is that technology has gone ahead of the protections we have in place. So I would just ask that when you do this, and you do work on it, that it not be done in an accusatory way, that realizing that there's always going to be some abuses, you want to minimize as much as you can. What happened in the past should be used as a protection for the future, not just to pass blame around. But again, I mean, having seen 9/11, and Jane and I were at the time, and so was Frank and Ileana, we never want to be in that position again of having intel out there that we didn't monitor and didn't properly surveil. At the same time, we don't want American rights violated. Also, I could just make one remark, which is off point a bit, but one thing I've noticed since I left the Congress, I want to give Congressman Kelly credit. He was able to suffer through my New York accent without the use of a translator. That's the first time in all the years we've known each other that he was able to listen to me. So, Trent, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you all on that. Mr. LoBiondo, I greatly appreciate your expertise and your dedication while you were here of going to Africa and to advancing our intelligence goals, and also paying attention to places that, as you said, many people hadn't gone in a long time. They've not been members of Congress or not been members of the administration. Could you tell us about some of the reactions that you got when you go? Those countries feel neglected, and when you meet with those officials, the reaction that they have to the fact that you're there has to be incredible. You leave with a to-do list, which is actionable when you come back, but also, as you were describing, our U.S. personnel don't get the attention that they deserve there. So they have limited resources, limited access, both on the State Department, on the intelligence community, and your actually being present, I'm certain made a huge difference. Tell us of some of those impacts.
So in some of these places that don't get a lot of attention for a lot of different reasons, the intelligence personnel that we have on the ground, while they're very dedicated, I think sometimes they feel ignored and neglected. That's what I got out of it. It was unbelievable to see their reaction of wanting to share their thoughts with a member of the Intel Committee on what was important, why it was important, what they needed, and why they needed it. And very often I would have discussions about what we were thinking of doing in a reauthorization bill and to try to get their take on it. And it was, it was pretty remarkable. I mean, sometimes I'd get, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Don't ever do it. It's not going to help us. It's going to hurt us. Or, we've been asking for this for a long time. You really need to make this happen. And you also will have the opportunity, as you know, for those of you who have traveled, that you will not only meet with our intelligence community, but with some of the in-country officials. Sometimes it might be the president or the prime minister or some high-ranking officials, which the State Department uses us to transmit messages to them, and that response was pretty remarkable as well. Sometimes I was chided by those country officials it was done tactfully, but basically, we didn't think the U.S. knew we were here. And that's not the message that we want to send. We have an opportunity to show them that it matters, and being a partner with the U.S. is a good thing. And then, last but not least, I always took the opportunity and found it very rewarding to sit down with the personnel. Some of the stations were very small. Not many of them had more than 15 people or so. But to be able to thank them because they're giving up and sacrificing so much, but it's also the opportunity, because they don't have much contact with Washington, to be able to ask questions to help them better understand why their commitment to serving their country in some of these places is really important. I was struck often by the station chiefs who emphasized that, as I mentioned in my remarks, that human intelligence is critically important. It's not enough on its own. It has to be combined with signal intelligence, and I'm probably saying stuff that all of you already know, but it is critically important that we don't let this go. Signal intelligence sort of takes care of itself with technology as it advances and NSA does its job. But on the human intelligence side, it's easy to say for our government that, this is too involved, we're not going to do it, it's too costly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a huge mistake.
Thank you. I agree with your comments, Frank. That's excellent that you've made that point on human intelligence. Mr. Langevin, as your legacy of your comments, I wanted to introduce you to one of our new staff persons that you'll be excited about, because you have made that the point, both in the Armed Services Committee and here, that technology and innovation and being on the cutting edge is incredibly important, and that companies, as they innovate, have difficulty in walking through the door, and there's no clear path for them to go. In our establishing of this, for this Congress, we created a technology and innovation professional staff member whose job is just that. I'd like to introduce you to Jonathan Clifford. Jonathan is eager to meet with you. We just had a conversation with him during your comments. And I'd invite each of you, to the extent that you have innovation and companies and things that we need to be looking at, that's his job. We found, as I know certainly all of you did, that when someone gets in touch with us with innovation and we try to assign it to someone who has a full portfolio in intelligence, that they don't have the ability to really assist them or to track down what do we need to be doing. We now have someone whose job is just that. I wanted to ask you about your institute. Cyber has been such an important aspect of what you've undertaken on both the Armed Services Committee and here. And cyber defense is incredibly important, but so is cyber offense. And you've been an advocate for, hey, we have to make certain that we're doing everything that we can. Could you talk for a moment about offense and defense, and that we need to be playing in both, Mr. Langevin?
First of all, thanks for the question, Mr. Chairman, and I commend you for adding the new staff member whose job it will be to be a point person for looking at new and emerging technologies. That's what's going to help to keep this committee and quite frankly, the country on the cutting edge to making sure that we're bringing those capabilities in. So on the cyber offensive defense, both are important, of course, always. And on the Solarium Commission, we came up with three main premises, and that's to deny benefits, shape behavior, but also impose costs. So on the defensive side, it's really incredibly important that we build in resilience. Absolutely critical, because, and we have to assume, as the administration, for example, in executive order, is moving to what's called a zero trust environment. You have to assume that the adversaries are going to get in. But if they do get in, you want to eliminate obviously you can do everything you can to prevent them from getting in, but prevent them from going and getting anything of value. So building in that resilience, things like data encryption, both at rest and in transit. Had that happened, for example, the OPM hack that happened years ago would not have the adversary who got that data wouldn't have gotten anything of any value, but the data was unencrypted, and unfortunately, it's probably led to untold damage. So building in that resilience and keeping the adversary out, but if they do get in, limit their ability to get anything of value. Shaping behavior is another one, and that is working with our partners and allies, of course, to establish norms and calling out and punishing those who violate those norms, and that might, for example, attack our critical infrastructure or compromise us in other ways. Working with partners and allies is incredibly important. But then at the end of the day, we have to have the ability to impose costs on our enemies and adversaries if they do attack us, compromise, or try to do damage to our allies and partners. Perfect case in point is the work that's done right now by U.S. Cyber Command. In partnership with NSA, U.S. Cyber Command and NSA have a critical mission to defend forward. And obviously the NSA, working with U.S. Cyber Command, informs where our vulnerabilities are, where the adversaries are, and keeps them keeps them out of our networks. But also we'll work with our partners and allies to impose costs on the adversary. So Ukraine is a perfect case in point, and General Nakasone has talked about this publicly, how both in the lead up to the Russia invading Ukraine, that we were working with the Ukrainians to build in resilience, and then after the Russian invasion, their networks were more secure as a result of our work with them. And but that need, the ability to hit an adversary or to take down their servers and their ability to operate, it's a capability that we reserve and need to employ at critical times, which I know we're doing.
Excellent. Jim Himes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a big thank you again to our panel. I want to circle back around to 702 because it's one of the 2 or 3 big things that we have to do in this committee this year, the reauthorization. And I think in this room we understand how essential 702 authorities are to stopping lethal fentanyl, to stopping cyber attacks, to stopping terrorist attacks, to understanding what's happening inside Iran, North Korea, and China. We have a lot of work to do to explain that to our colleagues. There's 2 legitimate, but I think overblown lines of criticism against 702. One is, if you read the sort of headlines of the privacy groups, that it is a massive warrantless surveillance program of Americans. Of course, it is not that. It is targeted exclusively at non-US people, It is actually quite small. There's a total of about 250,000 702 targets, all non-U.S. persons. The FBI, which does U.S. person queries, has access to about 7,800 of those targets. So it is, in fact, quite small. And it is subject to regular reauthorization by the FISA courts and therefore constitutional scrutiny. There's another line of thinking, which is that the FBI, who should be held accountable for some pretty significant abuses of FISA, including the release lately of FISA opinions, which indicated improper searches of both people associated with BLM and the January 6 attacks. That line of thinking basically says that the FBI is irredeemable, unreformable, and that it is politically motivated in its actions, despite the fact that, of course, the Inspector General's report found that whatever errors may have occurred in Crossfire Hurricane, they were not politically motivated. So, one very specific question, I'll aim it at you, Jim. What advice would you have for us with respect to reforms and messaging to those who are legitimately concerned about protecting the civil liberties and constitutional rights of Americans? And Peter, because you had so much contact with the FBI, I want you to give us the same advice with respect to reforms and messaging with respect to the FBI in particular. But Jim, let's start with you.
So, Jim, thanks for the question. So, first of all, I will say that during my time on the HPSCI, as well as Armed Services Committee, I understand the value of 702 authorities, and I too agree that it should be reauthorized. And on that, that bipartisan approach, I can remember when 702 was up for reauthorization in prior years, both Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Rupersberger got us together, went out to NSA and got the briefing of the value that 702 brought and how it allowed us to track down and in some cases remove some of our most hardened enemies from the battlefield that were attacking us, and the checks and balances that it used to make sure that 702 is used only within the confines of the law. So that's I just want to make that point of how important it is. And again, that was a bipartisan effort that led to its reauthorization. I hope it happens again with this committee and this Congress. In terms of other areas of government, or if there are those who misuse authorities, that's what oversight is all about. Both this committee, the IG investigations, or other checks and balances that are put in place. And people, certainly, if they step outside the confines of the law, should be held accountable. And I would, obviously, that's what, again, continued oversight is really all about. But not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. We need to make sure that these programs that keep the country safe are in place, stay strong. But again, oversight and accountability will be important as well, and have a transparent approach to how these authorities are used as is possible.
Thank you, Jim. And Peter, again, I direct the question about the FBI and U.S. person query because I suspect there aren't a lot of members who had as much contact over the decades as you did with the FBI.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. First of all, I think we should go back even to the 1970s, the Church Committee, which did find so many abuses that were being carried out. I think in response to that, there were so many restrictions put in place that we were caught off guard on September 11th. The wall between the FBI and the CIA, and that led to the whole expression of connect the dots. We had to find a way to connect the dots, and that was one of the reasons for expansion of FISA 702, and so it was certainly well-intended. Now, there have been abuses, there's no doubt. I'm not saying I disagree with you. Whether or not there was a political bias, I do think there was a judgment bias by certain people in the FBI, where they could have gone either way, and they went to the extent of being somehow convincing themselves that there was Russian collusion. I'm not trying to reopen that debate, but I think whether it was intentional or not, it shows the danger that you can have. If somebody does want to abuse it, they can, whether it's done out of good intentions or not. So we have to find a way not to relive what happened after the Church Committee hearings and put such restrictions in place that the FBI can't do its job, but find other ways to monitor it, and also that there are sanctions. that whether the abuses are intentional or unintentional, that people in the FBI know there will be sanctions against them if they do violate it. But again, I can't emphasize enough, I don't want us to, not us, we're out of it. I don't want any legislation to come out of the House which is going to so restrict the intelligence community from doing what has to be done. So it's really a fine line you have to draw between making sure we are fully protected, but also to prevent some of the abuses, intentional or unintentional, that did occur during the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Might I add one thing to that, and that is, I have said for years that security and liberty are not a zero-sum game. You either get more of both or less of both. And so I think the challenge for this committee, and I think this committee is totally up to it, and so is its ACE staff, is to do both at the same time. Reform 702 to some extent, have penalties for those who would willfully violate it, but at the same time, move ahead with a critical function of government. We would lose a huge amount. It would be a negative-sum game if we gave up 702.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. I have one more question. And Peter, thank you for the answer. Because language is so important in this very fiddly effort and heavy lift, both I.G. Horowitz and the Durham report found confirmation bias. That is to say that once the FBI was going down a path, they kept going down that path, but both explicitly said that they did not find political bias in the creation of, anyway, I think the distinction is really important there. So I don't know that we disagree, but I do think that the precision of language is important because this is...
You're right. The point I was trying to make is whether it was intentional or not, I did sense during those hearings that there was a bias somehow. Yeah, they were convinced there was collusion and they operated from that premise. Whether that was done for partisan purposes or whatever, it shows that abuses can be had, whether intentional or unintentional.
Yep.
That's the only point I was making.
Absolutely. Okay, last question, because I want to be respectful of my colleagues' time here. Jim, I want to direct this question to you. It's a technology question. Artificial intelligence. We're in a weird position in the Congress right now because half of AI experts are telling us that AI stands a 10% chance of leading to human extinction. Lots of people very much more knowledgeable than we are raising the alarm and saying it is really time to regulate AI. The problem, of course, is that almost nobody offers actionable suggestions, and it's a really tough area, right, because we're talking about information, and the Congress is quite rightly, by the First Amendment, prevented from doing an awful lot of regulation of information. So my question to you, Jim, is, and if anybody wants to pipe in quickly, but let me start with Jim, what are some actionable steps that the Congress should be taking right now with respect to artificial intelligence?
Yeah, so I am, like many, see the promise of AI, but I'm also concerned that it could go sideways and it could do things that are just unpredictable. So I would just say this: I would actually argue that you should be working with industry and hearing what they think would be appropriate bumper guards, if you will, regulation in that area, and making sure that at the outset, first and foremost, that as AI is developed, that there's a hard understanding of the importance of protecting privacy, civil liberties, so that it can't breach those types of those barriers. Hopefully, that obviously whenever AI is used with technology, that there's a requirement that there's a person in the loop, especially when life and death decisions could be made. So we can think of how AI will be able to bring together and make sense and analyze massive amounts of data in a short amount of time. That can provide policymakers with the very best information. And again, that's why it's so important to the intelligence community, because I've always believed that the best intelligence is always going to be the pointy tip of the spear, because if you know where your enemies and adversaries are or where your threats are coming from, then you can move more quickly to address or take out those threats. But when you're talking about employing technology and incorporating AI within those capabilities, you have to make sure that there's a person in the loop, so that there's a kill chain, for example, that it's the person making the decision, not the AI.
Thank you. Before I yield, does anybody have a very quick intervention on actionable things the Congress should be doing with respect to AI? Okay, in that case, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of y'all. And Mr. Stewart wanted me to yield time just to tell you thank you for what all y'all done in the national security world and what you've done for our nation, especially in the IC. So he wanted to thank you all for being here, and I relay his best. Second, Mr. LoBiondo, I kind of see the world the same way that you do in a lot of ways, and I've made over 20 visits to Africa, mostly in North Africa, the Sahel, and those areas that a lot of people don't go to. I also think there's a lot of value that we are missing in the Southern Hemisphere, and I don't see that as violent extremism or terrorism and all those things. I see it as the great power competition. Can you comment a little bit on just what the longevity of relationships, being in those places, and do you agree with me that South America is a huge return on investment if we just invest a little there?
Congressman Kelly, thank you very much, and thank you for your willingness to get out to these remote places and see firsthand what is going on. I totally agree with you that Southern Hemisphere, South America, is critical as we move forward. Our challenge, or your challenge now, as committee members, is you have limited time to travel. And how do you pick where you go to get the biggest bang for your buck with information gathered as you come back? I know that I had several trips into Colombia and South America. They were always very enlightening and informative. I chose to focus more on the African continent because it seemed like the challenges there from the terrorist groups and from an intelligence standpoint were much greater than they were in South America. But it's all important. I mean, you know, throw a dart anywhere on the globe and you've got a challenge that you've got to deal with. So as you try to figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, I think the feedback you will get from the people on the ground will be critical, as it was for me, with understanding what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, and maybe as importantly, because so few members travel with security clearances that you do, to be able to communicate with your colleagues those critical areas that should be very often are passed over because, listen, there are time constraints. You only can do so much with the time allotted, but colleagues need to understand why you went to Africa, what you found out when you got there, or South America, or some other place that's on the globe.
And then this is for all of y'all. Listen, we're losing the PR fight to retain 702 and our FISA authorities. And each of you know how valuable that is to protecting America. Unfortunately, the acts of a few bad people have tarnished the whole thing. And I don't think people understand how small of a percentage that is, but any is too many. So I say that. So some of y'all have mentioned, I've been in the military my whole life, my whole adult life, and there's a uniform code of military justice. When you do things that are outside the scope, you are punished for that. There is no such thing in the IC. That is one of the things I think that can help with 702. When somebody either recklessly or intentionally abuses the process, they should have consequences to that. But other than that, will each of you real quickly just give me one or two things that may help us convince the American people that FISA or 702 is good? What can we change or reform?
Well, to add to that, I would say publicize, get the FBI to admit, as they now have, what the abuses were. See if you can craft amendments specifically aimed at curbing abuses and making those who willfully or willfully negligently violate the lawful boundaries pay the consequence. I think that would be very helpful. But to keep in mind, there are two competing, but they have to be reconciled, goods here. One is protecting the security of America, and the other is protecting the privacy of Americans. We actually can walk and chew gum at the same time. If I could just add, though, to the travel deal. When I was here, we went to North Korea once. That was very interesting when Porter Goss was the chairman. And we also went twice, or I went twice, to Libya. and met with Muammar Gaddafi before the fall. And I remember after he fell, I asked, who is guarding the arms caches? And I was told, oh, they're safe, no problem. Well, guess what? All those arms migrated to the Sahel, which is a basically ungoverned part of North Africa. And so it is really important. Frank is right to pay attention. And final comment, there has been one ISIS attack in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't in the US, it was in Argentina, and it was in the 90s, and it was a Jewish center. And so we need to keep eyes on South America. We need to keep relationships up, and hopefully some of you will have the opportunity to do what Frank did, which is to check in with a lot of austere places that need to know that we're paying attention.
My time's expired, Mr.
I'm going
Chairman.
to just add to what my colleagues have said, especially Jane, for the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. It was the largest terrorist attack by Iranians. It was an Iranian terrorist attack, and on the day that the independent prosecutor was going to present his evidence to the authorities in Argentina, he had a mysterious death, and undoubtedly the Iranians were behind that as well. And we will never know what went behind that operation, but clearly Iranian thumbprints were all over that terrorist attack, and where hundreds of innocent Argentinians, including children, because they attacked a daycare center at the Jewish Community Center, died that day. And we're about to commemorate another sad anniversary in just 2 weeks of that bombing, the greatest threat.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I yield back.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. So good to see so many of you who I've served with, and each of you has been an invaluable member of HPSCI, and we appreciate your service. They often say hindsight is 20/20. As you look back on your service, do you see any unfinished business or even investigations from the committee that we might want to revisit? And have there been any aha moments since you've served on the committee and now have gone on to greater vistas?
I guess I would say 702 is not so much unfinished.
Yeah.
The fact is we did have debates on it during that time. We thought it was effectively addressed, but obviously more has to be done. So I would say, I don't know if you call it unfinished or just a continuation of a process which probably 20 years from now, people will be still trying to work around 702, find ways to make it effective, but also to protect it from abuses. And also, if I could just add one thing, I know Congressman Kelly was saying, how can you get public support back for 702 and others? I mean, I think you should highlight the successes. Like, I know there was going to be a liquid explosives attack on the New York City subway system in 2009, and that was prevented because of intercepts. But on the other hand, acknowledge the defects, acknowledge the abuses, whether intentional or unintentional, is almost unimportant in the long run, to find out how you can correct those abuses. But I think all of us who were here on 9/11, we saw that there's so many quote-unquote protections, not only protections, but a mindset was in place to make sure that liberties were being protected, but it was overly done in a way that the dots were not connected. So I think find a way to balance those two. I think that's probably the one continuing thing which is going to be here for as long as this committee is here, I would say.
I would say that I'm not sure it's an aha moment, but that on my frequent trips, I came to realize that while all of these different terrorist groups had their own focus, that they were really starting to combine forces. And that was something that worried me beyond what I can tell you. If ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab and the rest of these start sharing resources and sharing information, sharing technology, all aimed at us. Make no mistake, anything that they could kill or blow up that's in a democracy, especially the U.S. And the other thing was that while many of these countries have very limited resources and are very challenged, that, for example, the Central African Republic, the president is virtually the mayor of the capital, not the president of the country. They have no ability to control what's going on in the hinterlands of their own territories. which means that these terrorist groups have an opportunity to set up operational training grounds and go unfettered to, what their deadly purpose is. And if we understand that, we would better know that we should be involved with these governments, aiding them in ways that are appropriate to help our efforts in there. Many of them don't like this idea that they've got terrorists on their soil, but they can't do anything about it. They just don't have an ability to do it. So that falls to the U.S. and our partners. And we do have some good partners. I know in the case of Mali that France was an excellent partner. They were able to do some things that we were not able to do when we were able to share intelligence information with them. They were very effective in what they were able to do to thwart that.
I would just commend you for hiring the technology and innovation staffer. That is a great focus. And many of the things Jim has said will be able to be accomplished because now you have someone who really understands the technology. The future threats are going to come from AI, cyber, and a lot of these things that weren't around when I was here. And making sure that we not only have human intelligence and human beings focused on this, but leverage the technology to help human beings focus and leverage the human beings to help technology focus is going to be a huge part of your future success or your future lack of success.
Yeah, I support Jane's comments and agree with them wholeheartedly. A couple of things that are left undone that I would hope the Congress would take up. You remember, I think it was around 2019 that the Congress created the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and the commission was charged with creating an overarching strategy to better protect the United States from cyber attacks of significant consequence. Two of the recommendations that are still outstanding among several, although we had a great success rate in adopting there were 80 recommendations, and there's about a third of them that were adopted already, and some are medium and others are long-term goals. But establishing a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, it's a bit wonky, but without good data to analyze, it's hard to know, again, the right policy steps to make. And so certainly the Congress had just passed, about it was a year or two ago, the incident reporting legislation that will require incidents of significance to be reported, and that is being promulgated. That's being worked out with the Department of Homeland Security right now. But a bureau would, again, be able to work with private sector to collect the right amount of data to lead to better policies. The final thing I would say is passing the joint collaborative environment. The public-private partnership is so important, and having areas of the most critical of critical infrastructure, systemically important entities, if you will, working with the intelligence community or with government to be able to analyze threat data in real time is really important. Think of it in terms of, as opposed to passing emails back and forth, you're looking at Google Docs and you're seeing changes being made so that you can put context to the threats that each side is seeing. That's one of the things that is still outstanding. It's pending. I know it's Congress is looking at it again. I would encourage both of those things to be adopted.
Thank you. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. I've heard the expression when you leave Congress that you miss the circus but not the clowns. I'm glad you thought enough of us to come back here today and be with us to really have your valuable testimony and your insight here today. I want to touch on a couple subjects. We've heard a lot about 702 reauthorization today and how important that is, and I commend Chairman Turner and Ranking Member Himes for creating a bipartisan working group on 702 that I chair along and work with my colleagues on that, and would love to get your feedback on ideas, reforms, safeguards. I start with the premise that 85% of FISA works well. There's 15% that hasn't worked well. As part of our oversight obligation and responsibility, we need to fix that 15%. So we're looking at those reforms and safeguards to get at the abuses that we've seen at the FBI and other agencies to fix it. and get it reauthorized. And so would love to get your feedback on that, and so feel free to reach out to the working group and myself. I want to switch to another topic that has come up that deals with the handling of classified information. We've had several public instances of mishandling of classified information. In some ways very embarrassing, really unacceptable in terms of the behavior by, at the time, Vice President Biden, of course, former President Trump, and Vice President Pence. And so we've looked at what can we do to fix the statute. So Congressman Quigley and I, in a bipartisan way, have introduced legislation to add civil penalties to the statute, which we currently don't have now. As a former federal prosecutor, figuring out what are more tools we can add to the statute, ultimately to deter the mishandling of classified documents, which is a problem. I'd love to get your feedback on ideas that you would have on either the classification process of documents, which we're looking at, but what more we can do to ensure that we don't have any more instances of mishandling there. And maybe I'll start with you, Peter, and go down the line here.
Thank you, Darren. First of all, I think there is a certain amount of overclassification. But having said that, you're not in a position yourself to be declassifying. I mean, so assuming that it's properly classified, to me, we have to make the sanctions more significant, not to be hunting down people. Obviously, there's going to be human error. When you have thousands and thousands of documents which could cross your desk, it's always possible you could take something with you, by mistake. But once that's pointed out, every effort to be made to cooperate completely, not to slow walk it, not to, in any way try to impede the investigation. And I think the idea of civil penalties probably is worthwhile. Maybe not for the quote-unquote first offense, but once it's found that it's there, if there's not full cooperation, the civil penalty should kick in.
Thank you.
So thanks, Darren, and I certainly would agree with Peter. The overclassification, I don't know what the committee could do about that, but it's certainly something that should be looked at. And then I think it falls into two categories. So you've got a situation like former President Trump, President Biden, Vice President Pence that had classified documents, and what's the final analysis of that? What potential harm did it do to the country, and how does that come about? And what could we do to ensure when a high-ranking official is leaving office that it's very clear of what they cannot take? But I think the second part of this is sort of the Snowden part of it, that we've got people who willfully, intentionally steal classified documents, give them to our enemies, and in my view, the penalties cannot be strong enough. There's not enough of a deterrent. These people need to understand, if they're going to do this and put the United States of America in jeopardy, that they've got a very high price to pay. Not a slap on the wrist, not please don't do it again, not we'll look at it differently, but a real robust penalty that is a deterrent. I feel very strongly about that.
Well, first, let me apologize to this committee that I will have to leave at 11 sharp. This hearing may be over, but if I'm rude to any of you, I apologize. On this topic, the last law that of which I was principal author was the Overclassification Act of 2010 or 2011, which President Obama signed into law. And the point of it was there are steps we can take. Congress can mandate to require portion marking of documents, you all understand what that is, to educate folks who do classification about what the rules are. Classification protects sources and methods, not people from personal embarrassment, or protects their turf. I mean, we have to get that. And the executive branch has many different classification systems, so it's extremely hard for Agency A to talk to Agency B if there are classified documents involved, and that could be simplified. And this committee might take a lead on that. The last thing I would say is that the rules for declassifying by a president should be made much clearer. I can't imagine anyone ever intended that a president just thinking that things were declassified was enough of a trail to prove that they were declassified. And I think that ought to be written into regulation or legislation so that that can't happen again.
I agree with what my colleagues have said, and public trust, anything that erodes public trust in our institutions or individuals in power who have held power, we're going to have a crisis in trust in our government and trust in our institutions because of these perceived abuses of power. And whether it's willful, unintentional, what are the penalties that these individuals will be facing? There is a lot of confusion about classification of documents and when they can be declassified and who can declassify. And I agree, there's too much classification. So I don't know what this committee can do about that. But the penalties are unclear, and anything that erodes public confidence in our institution is a detriment to the fabric of our representational government. And I worry about this crisis of confidence. And all the polls indicate when they ask the people, do you think that we're on the right track, on the wrong track? What do you think about this institution and this organization? And you see it diminishing every time. And that saddens me because we've got to all do a better job of, once again, getting the public trust in our institution, or if not, this will be a great detriment to the future of our government and our democracy.
Likewise, I share the comments of my colleagues on the classification issues. I think there is a tendency often to overclassify things that aren't necessarily classified. I think we've all been in those briefings, and we come out of our head, those HPSCI briefings, sometimes scratching our heads and say, was really all of that classified? And often it's probably not. So I think looking at how things are classified is important. Holding people accountable if there's violations of the rules, that's important. Having those checks and balances. Transparency is vitally important to maintaining trust and confidence. I've often said that the vast majority of people in the intelligence community and law enforcement go to work every day doing the very best they can, deliver their oath, protect their community, protect their countries. And if there are a few bad apples that violate those rules, it hurts everyone. And so there has to be accountability. One other thing I'll mention that's kind of tangential to some of these things, especially when we've talked about the high-profile leaks that have happened or betrayal of their oath to protect things like classified information, is the oversight process of monitoring who that have those very select special clearances. Obviously, protecting privacy and civil liberties of the American people is vitally important. That's what the Constitution and laws ensure. For those who have high-level clearances, there should be a different level of scrutiny. If you don't want the clearance, you don't want the scrutiny, then don't accept the clearance. Just don't go out, don't apply for those type of jobs. If you do have the clearance, there should be a review of the level of scrutiny that people are under. If there were, so many of these breaches would have been caught early on, and it's been one of the things, I guess, as I look back at my time in Congress, I wish we had done more to rein that in, to put more scrutiny on those who do have the clearance. Again, protecting privacy and civil liberties is vitally important, but for those who have even the highest level of clearance, it's a different level of scrutiny. If you don't want the scrutiny, then don't ask for the clearance.
Thank you.
Mr. Kester.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, all of you. It's great to see everybody again. Thank you for your service to this committee during the time that you were in Congress. I want to ask you all what is kind of a thorny question, but I don't mean it in the spirit of being combative or even opening a Pandora's box or rehashing old fights. But given the events of the last several years, all of us or many of us either were serving in Congress or watched the Russia investigation and so forth, and some of the missteps of the FBI and so forth. And all of us have opinions on that. Some of them are opposite opinions. But we've got another presidential election coming up. We've got congressional races every few years. My question is one that I think is important for the Congress and for the American people, which is, for those of you that have an opinion on this, when do you think it is appropriate for our intelligence agencies, for the FBI in this case, to look into any kind of collusion or relationship between, let's just say, any candidate and a foreign government. This could be a question that's relevant 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Somebody may be colluding in 20 years with the PRC. So given the events that we experienced as a country and as a Congress, and I know people weren't thinking about this question, but as you sit here as members who sat on this committee, who sat in Congress, your thoughts on that, if any?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, it is important to look into that. I mean, there can be any number of countries that candidates can be involved with, intentionally or unintentionally. I think, though, there should be a higher threshold before they go public, before they go to the FISA court, and before it becomes almost a theme that there is definitely collusion there. I mean, you could probably make an argument in many cases that there's always some evidence of some foreign involvement. When does that reach the threshold, though, that it should become a full-scale investigation, that there should be an application to the FISA court, and that there should be not done in an even-handed way? So, no, I'm not disputing the fact that we have to look, probably more so than ever, with foreign involvement in so many different ways. I mean, we are in many ways one world now, and it's, so my concern was not with the fact that it was looked into. I thought it was looked into in an uneven way, and we have to try to avoid that in the future. Also, let me just make this clear for the record with the FBI. I had a very good working relationship with the FBI in New York all those years. That was not an issue. There were some people at the top levels of the FBI that I had, did a real disagreements with. But no, I don't think, just like we shouldn't put in such restrictions that 702 is not going to work, we shouldn't also put in restrictions that investigations of foreign collusion should not be looked into. Again, it's a balance.
Agreeing with Peter King, which I'm hesitant to do too often, I think that the threshold for these agencies getting involved needs to be somehow determined. That it seems that each one might have an arbitrary way to determine if they're going to pursue certain information. There should be irrefutable evidence, and there should be a standard that they have to follow, so that we don't go, chasing down rabbit holes without good reason. Now, following up on those things that are proven to be critical and important must be done, has to be done, but there's got to be a more uniform way that it's determined how they move forward, I think especially with the FBI.
Colluding with a foreign power under circumstances that you describe is espionage, and the laws should apply equally to everyone. It is true that some allege that there were abuses by the FBI. We don't have to go there right now. The FBI's had a mixed history, certainly. It started under J. Edgar Hoover and some of the other activities on various watches, but I remember Bob Mueller coming in to the FBI, I think it was 4 days after or 4 days before 9/11, when we discovered that the dots were not connected and that parts of the FBI weren't talking to other parts of the FBI, and heroic action by him and a team to make the place work well. So I'm not sure who should set the standards, but it is, I think, crucial that we not take certain activity out of the purview of our law enforcement agencies, because espionage by anyone is a crime.
And I agree with that. It is always appropriate to look at and investigate collusion between a candidate or a public official and a foreign entity. And I don't think any of us would say, "Oh, hands off. You can run for president, and we won't look at what you're doing." The problem is the misinformation and the leaking, the unauthorized leaks to the media, when all the facts are not presented and cannot be presented to the media because it is a closed investigation. And that leads, again, to the erosion of public confidence in our institutions. So is it appropriate? Yes, always. But the problems are the leaks of misinformation, whether purposeful or not, and the damage that does for your work, in order to go to your members, your colleagues, and say, hey, we need these powers to be reauthorized. And they're going to say, no, our institutions have messed up too many times. So public erosion of confidence is a problem.
I think, again, transparency is just so important. I agree with the statements that my colleagues have made. It has to be a clear threshold, and is actionable intelligence, actionable information, it should be pursued. But striking the right balance of checks and balances is essential. Following the money is important, of course, and that's why financial disclosures are so important, and making sure that you're connecting the dots of where people have their money coming from is important in that whole process. But when there's actionable intelligence information that law enforcement needs to pursue, they need to be able to do that, and it should be done according to the by the book and with the right checks and balances in place.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to pause for just a minute. Like Jane, unfortunately, I have to run to the Capitol. Dan Crenshaw is going to take over, and he's going to take my seat for his question. Thank you.
Okay, I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Thank you all for being here. It's been fascinating to listen to you. Thank you for paving the way for us. I want to note that there's strategic threats and there's tactical threats. That's how we see things in the military often, and everybody, I think, has a pretty good grasp on what our strategic threats are. There's Russia invading Ukraine, there's land war in Europe, there's the rise of China, there's North Korea with their nuclear weapons, et cetera. There's Iran trying to destabilize an entire region. These are, I think, better classified as strategic threats. But then I ask a sort of a rhetorical, semi-rhetorical question, a bit of a thought experiment. If you could choose one country outside the United States and make it better in every single way, make it more prosperous, make it more secure, improve its civic institutions, which country would you choose? It's a rhetorical question, but I don't want to put anybody on the spot.
To improve the country?
10 times better. Make any country in the world 10 times better. Which country would you choose? I would choose Mexico. That's what I would. I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I would choose Mexico, 100%, because that is a tactical threat right now. Organizations that are paramilitary in nature, better equipped, better funded, more ruthless than any other organizations on the planet. And I think what makes this threat even worse is the current president of Mexico, who does not seem to want to be a partner to the United States, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And this concerns me a great deal, especially recently because these drug cartels, especially the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels, are responsible for the deaths of about 80,000 Americans a year through their fentanyl poisoning. That specifically comes from them. Nobody else but them, and of course the precursors come from China. And I think this needs to be on Congress's radar in a much more substantial way. One question I have for you, Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, is how do you, given your experience as Chairwoman of Foreign Affairs, how is our State Department doing on this issue? Are they properly engaged? Okay, no. All right, can you expand on that?
Well, thank you for that question, and I so agree with you, Mr. Crenshaw, that Mexico should be that country because it truly impacts what happens in our country directly. And I would add to that list the axis of evil of Latin America, which is Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. All of these countries are in cahoots with the Iranian regime and other entities, and they allow penetration within their soil. And in Nicaragua, Russia has now established a foothold where Nicaraguan law was amended so that it allows Russians to have facilities in Nicaragua, spy facilities, and they can operate freely. And off the coast of Venezuela, you see Russia and China and Iran operating as well. So we've got a real hotbed of potential terrorist activity, and certainly gathering of secrets and spying on the United States right in our own hemisphere. And I would say that on your question about the State Department, we have always found in a bipartisan manner in our Foreign Affairs Committee that the State Department really needs to ramp up its game. Wonderful people, certainly Foreign Service officers who are the best of the best, and we see them in very difficult positions, and they're doing their best of protecting our homeland. But the State Department is too much in the, I would think, the diplomacy role. That is they're 90% of what they're doing, but they're ignoring the clear and present dangers of our country. And
it seems
some
that
of their
it's often ignored
ambassadors
for-
go
for-
native when they go to the country. They start to think that they are part of the Egyptian government, or they're part of the Lebanese government.
Well, that leads
No,
me
you're
directly to
representing
what
the
I wanted
United
you
States.
to comment on, actually, as our current ambassador, Ambassador Salazar. I've read some concerning stories about him. Curious what you think about this, and other members might think about his role. This is exactly the concerns, which that he was almost directly undermining his own administration because of the desire, the most outsized desire just to have a cozy relationship with President Obrador in this case.
And I would say, Mr. Crenshaw, that that's a problem for Republicans and Democratic administrations, not just the current one. It's been an ongoing problem to have, and I'm not commenting on that appointment itself, but for so many of the ambassadors that we see going before the Senate committees, they seem to have an incorrect attitude about what they're supposed to be doing. And whether it's something as simple as helping an American business that's having a difficulty in that country, they say, oh, no, we can't get involved. And you look at them, well, you have this commerce section in your embassy, and that's what you're supposed to do, help American businesses with the red tape. So they just seem to go native. And of course, diplomacy is important. We want to be partners with all of our allies, but they have to have a better recognition that not all of these countries have the best interests of the United States at heart, and they are not allies, they're actual enemies of the United States. But I love the State Department, love the individuals, but there's a culture of get along and go along with, within the bureaucracy, and I see that as a problem.
With respect, I agree with you that relationships with Mexico are complicated, but it is in our interest to find a way forward to have a cooperative relationship with Mexico and to criticize them when they're wrong. Without commenting on the behavior of Ambassador Salazar, which I've seen the allegations, but I don't know that they are accurate, I would say that the fentanyl challenge is a whole-of-government challenge. It's not just the State Department. The Department of Homeland Security does have a focus on this. Is it doing as well as it should? I think that's something to assess. But full disclosure, I'm on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and I know that Secretary Mayorkas wants this, wants his department to be effective. But obviously our law enforcement agencies and everyone else needs to focus on the scourge of fentanyl. And you're right that the precursors start in China, they don't start in Mexico, and we don't want any of our border countries enabling the importation of fentanyl into our country.
Fully agree with that. I'm out of time, and I know we need to wrap up by 11, so we need to get through everyone. I can't read this. Okay. I recognize Congresswoman Spanberger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to ask, just based on your experience, the challenge that sometimes the committee faces is that we have classified hearings, we have really great conversations, and as was the case even this week from our hotspots meeting, there were some clear, actionable things we could be considering from a legislative perspective to address some of the issues discussed. But then we go back to our colleagues outside of the committee, and it becomes kind of a question for me, how do we say, you know, lights are flashing, or this is a priority, or this is how we could get at that challenge that I know you're concerned about, because we had these conversations in HPSCI, or we had this, you know, testimony before HPSCI. So do you have any recommendations about when we get dug in on an issue, or we get alerted to a clear potential path forward, how do you bring in colleagues who don't have the committee exposure? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants to respond.
I think one way to do it would be to encourage more members to come down to the SCIF to get the briefing. I think that puts more of the fear of God into them when they actually hear it in the SCIF and how serious it is. Unfortunately, you have members on both sides, and no matter what you tell them, they're not going to really listen. They have preconceived notions. But I would think to the extent you can provide these classified briefings to members of Congress to show them how real these issues are and how either misguided or slightly off course their preconceptions may be. But it is a real challenge, and it's particularly a challenge when you hear one thing in the SCIF, you hear one thing at a classified briefing, then you see somebody going on television and saying the complete opposite, and how do you counter that without yourself divulging classified information? I mean, Frank and I went through that situation a few times. So, but in any event, it's not easy. And a lot depends on the goodwill of the members, and that's not always there.
So it is challenging to be able to get colleagues to understand the critical nature of some of these issues. But one of the things I remember that we did when we were doing a reauthorization of 702 was to bring General Keith Alexander in and to bring him into the SCIF and in a series of meetings make available to all members of Congress the opportunity to question him directly, to listen to his presentation. It was rather discouraging on such an important issue that so few members took advantage of it. And I know that some of us that were on HPSCI at the time took a list of colleagues that were not on the committee and sort of went to them and said, you know, hey, this is going to take place. What questions do you have? Come and ask General Alexander. Make up your own mind. You know, don't take what is out there in the general public that may be erroneous, as Peter is saying, and then regurgitate that as gospel. So it's challenging, but it can be done, and it can be done in a forum where it could make it interesting for other members to be able to understand these things.
I think there's another dimension to your question, though, which is how does the public get informed if people are briefed in classified settings and then can't talk about anything? I remember in my day, a number of members didn't want the classified briefings because they wanted to be able to talk about stuff. I also knew then and know now that open source information includes a lot of the stuff that members get briefed on, and you're in a conundrum because you've been briefed in a classified setting and you can't talk about stuff you're reading in the newspaper. So I think the challenge is to flip it a bit, to have some public hearings. That's what I would urge you to do, like this one, where you can air in public information that is publicly available, and then to go into classified settings to get more in-depth information. That would somehow bridge the gap and enable this committee to showcase the fact that it is to the public, because it has a very small public face, that it is on top of things that should concern them and enable the public to understand what should concern them. I think this is a bigger gripe than just for this committee. I think the case has not adequately been made to the public about what the real threats are. And the public needs to, I mean, after all, this is a democracy with a little d, needs to understand and engage with what courses of action our country will take and what the human costs are, both in terms of human life and resources of those actions.
Well, that is an excellent question, and I think as this committee looks to reauthorize some of the important programs that are before you, expanding that relationship between this exclusive committee and the members at large is going to be so important. Too often you're just siloed away, and the members don't feel like they're getting all of the information. And in the sheets that we were given about this panel, you told us to inform the committee's legislative and oversight priorities and engagement with the intelligence community. HPSCI has conducted a series of open, bipartisan panels that have featured, and you go on to explain all of that. These open hearings, as Jane has said, they're so important because it makes the public comfortable with testimony, with what they're hearing, and to have the members, your colleagues, feel like they're not being deprived of critical information. And having more settings where you can invite your colleagues to the SCIF and look at the relevant paper that our intelligence community has produced, that's going to give them confidence in your work, and it will make it easier for you to reauthorize these important intelligence community tools that we need to have reauthorized. So it's a great challenge, but bringing more people in and having these open hearings, they're wonderful.
Thank you for the comments, and particularly the reference to 702. We're facing that this year, so I think there's a number of actionable things we can do. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Gomez for his 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. That was a perfect question because it's one of the things, I'm brand new to the committee, and I've said exactly what former Representative Harman said is, you haven't made the case on certain issues. Like I said that regarding TikTok. I'm like, I don't know how to argue that this is the big boogeyman, right? Everybody makes the argument that our personal information is out there anyways. And so I'm having trouble making that argument for people, but it's exactly that. How do you take some of this information? One of the things I want to know from all of you, this committee is a unique committee. It's almost like I feel like I have a secret power because I have so much information, but I can't use it. I'm always Clark Kent, I guess. How would you use the information that we learn in these committees in a responsible way? Number one. Number two, what is a lesson that you learned from being on the committee? Like, watch out for this. This is one thing that like everybody falls for. Don't fall for it. Everybody like makes this mistake. And just an open question to the panel.
I have to leave in a minute, and I apologize to the last member. I may not be here for your questions, but I have a comment about that. One of my big big complaints here was that the briefs by Intelligence Committee experts were in a very narrow lane, and you would ask someone, well, what about that? And he would say, well, I'm not testifying on that. And putting the whole picture together, getting somebody, either the director of an agency or somebody with a broad enough authority to help the committee understand the whole picture was very difficult. And as you know, there's a special intel language. It takes a while to learn it. Yeah. And so many acronyms that are impossible. So I would think in the committee's interest, and frankly in the country's interest, there should be more broader briefers with broader mandates who come before the committee, and some effort to make sure that the members of the committee who take this responsibility seriously, no one made you serve on this committee. No. It's a high honor to be appointed by leadership to serve on this committee. To make sure that all of you have the best, most accurate picture of what the country faces.
I would say that have the members be more cautious about media appearances that they make right after a classified briefing, because I've seen some colleagues can't wait to rush to those microphones, and that can be putting our men and women in harm's way, and again, it erodes the public's confidence. Thank you.
Mr. Gomez, we all share your frustration having served on the Intelligence Committee, and you have privy to important information, and you want to be reassuring to constituents, things, for example, but you're obviously bound to protect sources and methods and protect classified information. I would say among colleagues, I think the easiest thing to do, obviously, is encourage them to go to get a briefing in the SCIF. Even better if there's something that's particularly relevant, working in a bipartisan manner to maybe hold a briefing with members of Congress that aren't per se on the committee, if that's something that is allowed by the chairman and the ranking member, if they can put together briefings for those members that might have questions, especially if they're outspoken on something but might be misinformed. Bipartisan basis, you can work to make sure that they get the briefing that they need. In terms of the public, and this is what I did, quite frankly, I'd worked sometimes with the briefers or with the committee staff to come up with a unclassified way of talking about the topic. And the staff is incredibly talented and dedicated, and they will clearly work with you to try to come up with a way of conveying information that doesn't violate classification levels.
Thank you.
I very clearly remember when I was in your position as a new member of HPSCI, and you're getting all this information and it's classified. You're warned about what you can say and how you can say it. I found it was extremely helpful to talk to the professional staff about what language you could use and how you can use it, and even some of your senior colleagues that are on the committee to be able to understand that it is important to communicate that these important issues are being discussed to your constituents and to the broader country, but in a way that's not going to put anything in jeopardy. And that's a minefield. I mean, you're walking in there sort of blindfolded backwards at night, and you don't want to step on something that's going to blow up. But there are ways to do it if you work at it, and I think senior colleagues and professional staff are the answer to that.
I would just add to that what Frank said. It's important to talk to the staff, get some idea what you're going to say. It may not guarantee you're going to do it exactly right, but it's going to minimize the transfer error. The other thing I would say is going into any briefing at all, to try, and it's very hard to do away with preconceptions. Go in there really somehow telling yourself that you really are an open slate and you want to hear both sides. I think too many members I've seen, maybe I've been guilty myself, you go in with a preconception, you know what's right, you know what should be done, and you miss part of the important part of the briefing. So, but I wish you well. Thanks for being on the committee. And again, it is a minefield, but it's well worth it if you can walk through it. Because to me, this was the most impressive, outstanding committee to be on. Yeah. And again, to know, probably the most frustrating thing is to pick up the newspaper in the morning from all sides and find maybe 90% of what they're saying about a particular issue is wrong, and you have to keep your mouth shut. That's tough. Yeah. It's tough for any of us to keep our mouth shut anyway, but in those cases, it really is. So,
thank you. I appreciate that.
All right. The gentleman from Krypton yields back. Sorry, I just had to. The chair now recognizes Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you so much. Mr. Crenshaw, we both chuckled when he said he looked like Clark Kent, but I have to tell you, Jimmy, you're better looking than Clark Kent. You have greater powers than him. Don't let Clark Kent take the power from you. Thank you all so much for being here. It's so good to see you all. Having served with you all, it's been an honor to have served with you all during the time that you were here, and now to get your expertise as a look back on what you were doing. I had a question particularly for you, Congressman LoBiondo. I was really moved by your testimony with regard to Africa and the concern that you have for us not taking resources away, but actually increasing resources. Have you seen that in your time when you were in HPSCI, movement away from an area that later on events kind of let us look back and say that was a mistake, that we've done that?
Well, thank you for your service and thank you for your question. And the answer is absolutely. What I observed over my time was gradual, and unless you were really looking for it, you weren't going to see it because there are so many global issues that are sucking all the oxygen out of the air. But the reality is that the potential for the African continent and the countries in Africa and the partnerships that they can provide with the United States of America are enormous. Mm-hmm. But we have, over numerous administrations, both parties, decided that it was too expensive, it was too fill in the blank, and have gradually pulled back. And it's a mistake, and it's a problem. And when that void is there, we can just watch China come in and eat our lunch. Right. And as I said in my statement, they're bribing their way across Africa, and because of the nature of the challenges of many of these countries and their leaders, the money is powerful for them. So the United States is not offering those kind of things. The United States doesn't come in and bribe officials. We have laws about that. China does not. And we have to be more cognizant of what is happening, why it is happening, and how we should be increasing our activity there all across the board, whether it's State Department, whether it's intelligence, whether it's special forces that play a key role that don't get talked about very often. And it worries me a great deal that this slide continues.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, it's China as well as now we see private organizations like Wagner throughout the Sahel. It's really very disturbing. And so I'm grateful that you're continuing to raise the alarm on that. And, you know, you gentlemen are New York, New Jersey, right there. You saw the time between the first, as you said, Mr. King, between the first attack on the World Trade and then the last one. We kind of were silent about that. And when these things creep up on us and we're not vigilant, it tends to bite us in the patootie.
Let me say it's good to see at least a former New Yorker on the panel.
Yes.
And I'm aware of your father's service, and you certainly appreciate that. No, you're right, though.
I don't know if you know, Mr. Crenshaw, Peter King's father was the sergeant when my dad was a rookie who trained him in the academy. So we have
and he trained your father a lot better than he trained me. So anyway, but thank you for that. No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It seems like ancient history, but it was also ancient history on September 10th, 2001, looking back at 1993. That was way in the past, and we saw what happened. No, and I'm not trying to sound the alarm, but I say we have to be alert. I mean, you know, all the preventions have been taken by the NYPD. I think they've stopped 19 different attacks against New York. That's been cut back substantially, but it's still there. The threat is there, as there are any number of other threats. I think sometimes, as a people, we focus on what's in the newspaper today, what's in the media today, what members of Congress are talking about today, and we forget the past. And if we forget the past, we're going to be forced to relive it. So thank you for your service. And
thank you.
As far as I'm concerned, you have to act as a New Yorker on this show.
Thank you.
Forget everything else. You
know. I know.
Remember at heart, you're a New Yorker.
Mr. Langevin, one of the things that you talked about was the need for us to retain talent, particularly in the intelligence area and the cyber security space. What are some of the programs that you think have worked best? You talked about being novel in that. What do you think are the ways that we can support that as we look to our next appropriation, as we look towards the next intelligence legislation, not just new talent, diversity? What are the things that you think work well?
Well, one of the great programs that I support is the Cyber Core program, and I championed increasing the amount of money that goes into that program to expand the number of students we can bring in. But Cyber Core is a scholarship for service program. First of all, the school has to be designated as a cyber center of excellence, so NSA accredited, and once they have that designation, students can apply, in the college can apply to be a part of the Cyber Core program. So it pays basically for tuition for the junior and senior year of the student. There's a stipend of over $30,000 a year that's given while the student is in school. And then when they graduate, they agree to go into a job in federal government in cybersecurity for a period of 2 years to give back. So it's a wonderful program. There's a couple thousand students in it now. We need to increase that dramatically. I've often said that obviously one of the big challenges both for private sector and for government that it's about there's a huge deficit in the number of qualified, talented individuals to go into these jobs. There's over 700,000 jobs that go unfilled approximately right now across the country in cybersecurity. That number is only expected to grow, and we need to draw on a diverse talent pool to make sure that we're filling those jobs. And so CyberCore is one of the pathways to doing that. But other areas, what I want to do at the Institute of Cyber and Emerging Technologies at Rhode Island College that I'm starting is working with local high schools so that kids in their senior year, hopefully introduce them to a pathway to studying cybersecurity as a career opportunity. That means that when they graduate, they can enter most likely a job that pays 6 figures, The advantage that the kids have growing up today, unlike probably all of us that had to learn about computers and cyber, and the kids, by contrast, are growing up as digital natives, and they take to technology like fish to water. We want to harness that ability, that talent, and while they're studying in high school, they're also the idea is to earn college credits, so that they already have a foot in the door to entering college and have college credits already under their belt, and gets them that much closer to graduation.
And the gentleman yields back.
Yeah, excuse me, Congresswoman, if I may, and for the committee.
Very quickly, please.
Across the intelligence community, but especially CIA, the committee can do something about refining how long the qualifications take. We have some very young, bright, talented people who want to join the CIA, but when it takes 18 months to get clearance or 24 months, they go do something else. The committee can do something about that.
Thank you. And the gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stewart from Utah.
You know, hearing has gone long when the witnesses actually stand up and leave, right? So, hey, I came back just to tell you all thank you for coming and for your service in Congress and on the committee. Lobo and Peter, you've become great friends. You and I and Ileana and I served together through some challenging times on the committee, and I appreciate your comments about kind of a reset on the committee, something that many of us support. But again, thank you for your testimony today. Thanks for your expertise, and thanks for coming and share a little time with you. And let you know we miss all three of you here in Congress, and the country is, I think, a little less because you're not here serving with us. So thank you.
Chris, good luck to you and your family as you go forward.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Good luck to you, and thanks for your service.
The gentleman yields back. That concludes our questions. I would like to once again thank our panelists for their perspective and insights. The committee is now adjourned.